and welcome to the Mr. 50mm YouTube channel. You may recognize this camera from the Spoils from Korea video. I'll link to that below if you haven't watched it already. It's the camera that I picked up for a whole 30 Canadian dollar dues, or roughly 3 US cents. In this video, we're going to get into an in-depth review of the NX10. Let's get into it. What is the NX10? Well, it's this camera right here, and it's a camera with a 1.55 times crop factor APS-C sensor. It's a mirrorless camera as well, and it comes hot on the heels of the Micro Four Thirds cameras of the day, like the Panasonic G1. It was announced on the 6th of January 2010, and it features a 14.6 megapixel CMOS sensor made by Samsung. And it uses Samsung's own NX mount. Autofocus on this camera is contrast detect only. The ISO range is 100 to 3200 with no expansion, and shutter is good for 30 seconds to 1/4000th of a second. It shoots 3 FPS and for only 3 RAWs, not many. Anyways, it features a 921K dot EVF in the back, and the rear display is a 614K dot OLED panel. Uses SD cards for memory, and additionally this camera has sensor shake cleaning for, automatic sensor cleaning. The camera weighs in at 410 grams with the battery loaded, roughly 0.41 plena. And finally, the NX10 shoots video at 720p, 30 FPS. When it was new, it shipped with the 18-55 kit lens and cost roughly $699 USD in 2010. That's about 1,024 modern eagle feathers, or roughly 1,460 angry maple goose eggs. For more details on the NX10, I will link to the description of it, or its spec page on DPReview down below. Right, what is up with my NX10? So before we move on, I do want to let you know that I basically made my NX10 into an NX11. And I did this by basically loading the NX11 firmware onto the NX10. For those of you who don't know, the NX11 was a very mild refresh that did some minor physical tweaks and had some software adjustments compared to the NX10. And in essence, it was effectively a firmware upgrade that Samsung wanted to squeeze some more sales out of, so they made a new model. Anyways, as is tradition though, I'm not responsible for any sideways things that happen if you do decide to try this on your own NX10. But if you would, I'm going to link to the DPReview forum post that I found, which discovered this weird thing. And it's going to be down in the description below. And essentially what it boils down to is that you could download the NX11 1.12 firmware. And again, that's on Samsung's webpage. And then you could flash it onto your NX10. And if you had the right firmware for your NX10, which mine did, it'll kind of not even bother checking what camera you have, and it'll just load. So yeah, kind of weird, but yeah, interesting thing that they didn't bother checking till later, which, yeah, that's the thing. If your NX10 has the most recent firmware, Samsung did close a loophole, and that firmware now checks for, the correct camera model if you're going to update your firmware. So you won't be able to install the NX11 firmware on that NX10. There is a way, I believe, to roll back your NX10 firmware so that you can install the NX11 firmware, but I'm not sure what the process is, as I wasn't required how to do that. So you might need to dig on your own if your camera is in that state. So why do that? Why modify with this, or why modify the NX10 anyways? Well, the NX10 got most of the functions that the NX11 got, such as the eye function customization in a later firmware, but Samsung left out 2 features that I personally found useful. One of them is a manual focusing aid. So the aid essentially is a like little bar graph on the side of your EVF or display that kind of goes up and down and indicates maximum contrast. When you have your maximum contrast detected, it's basically in focus. And it picks the area that's in the center of the frame to display this little bar graph thingy. And yeah, it's essentially a weird way to do focus peaking, kind of. But yeah, it's not present in the NX10. It is on the NX11. The other thing that they didn't include in the NX10 was something called framing mode, which essentially disables the live exposure and keeps the EVF and rear display / live view at the fairly bright exposure, or at a fairly bright exposure, letting you compose more easily instead of like darkening or changing things around. And this does again help if you're shooting in low light settings. So if you find those two features something that you would want on your NX10, I think it's worth the modification. If not, just go with the most current NX10 firmware. So what is special about this camera? Well, the NX10 gets the title of first mirrorless camera with an APS-C sized sensor. And it's also the first camera from Samsung that is a mirrorless camera, and it's Samsung's second camera to be produced with a, APS-C size sensor in it. With the first essentially being the Pentax K20 that was rebadged as a Samsung GX20. However, it should be noted that Samsung does have other cameras in its lineup. It had point and shoots before, and it had rebadged other Pentaxes prior. And they've generally been in the camera game for some time prior to the NX10. And this extends all the way back to film days. So Samsung isn't new to imagery / photography. Anyways, the NX camera is an interesting system, by the way. If you didn't know, it was a system that I think had probably one of the shortest runs unofficially. Samsung never officially made an announcement killing the NX10. They just stopped selling them one day. And with the last camera that Samsung released being in 2015 and production stopping around 2016, it basically meant that the NX system was around for about 6 years. That's less than the Nikon 1, which is unfortunate. And it's also less than, the Canon EF-M series. The only system I think that had shorter runs than this was the Pentax Q line and Samsung's own NX Mini. That's 2 L's for Samsung. Dang. Shooting with the NX10, operation and feel. I do want to emphasize how small this camera is. Its footprint is actually a tiny bit smaller than the Panasonic G1. I've got the G1H here just to show you, but look at that. It is even a thinner camera. And it does this while housing an APS-C sized sensor. Quite impressive. Now, small does not mean uncomfortable in this case. The camera itself is pretty nice to hold. The grip is small, as you can see. It's not very deep, but again, it's not bad. And with the material that's covering the actual grip and the perch on the back for your thumb, it doesn't feel that uncomfortable, especially if you're using the smaller pancake lenses that Samsung made, like the one that I got here, the 30f2. All in all, I also got to say that this camera, I think, has a pretty nice look to it with its rounded edges. Additionally, I do want to point out that on the side of the camera, there is a port door, and it is an actual door. It flaps open and shut. It's not a rubber flap. It's a bit of a nice small touch, and it helps make this camera feel a little more solid. But what else helps it feel solid is its weight. It's actually fairly similar to, again, the G1 or the G1H, and it's actually a smidgen lighter when you include the battery for weight. But when you hold both cameras, the Samsung, given its smaller size and its more, increased density, combined with the nicer finish, I think makes this camera feel just a bit more substantial than the G1 or G1H, which felt pretty dang plasticky. Now, when it comes to buttons and controls, the NX10 has only one command dial, and it is right here. It's just behind the shutter button, and it works well enough, but it would be nice to have a second one somewhere where my thumb could reach. But alas, there is not one. But that being said, for a single command dial implementation, it's pretty well done. You can generally find that on the back of the camera, there are a bunch of dedicated buttons, and you can either use them with the command dial to navigate your options, or use the D-pad thing in the back of the camera. Again, with the button placement overall, most things are easy and within reach of your thumb, so that's kind of nice. With the exception of the menu button all the way here, which makes sense. Again, it's a pretty well thought out camera. The only two buttons that I'm not really a fan of are the ones on the top plate. They are right here. I personally find that they are just a little too far back, and my fingers kind of have to go back a little far to use them. If they're just being pushed back a little or pushed up a little further closer to the shutter, I think it would have been a much better placement, but that's not how it is. Another thing on the back is, as we mentioned before, that rear panel. It is a OLED of the 600 odd K-dots variety. Again, it's quite nice, and if you have a look, it's got some of Samsung's GUI and iconography, words are hard, and combined that with the camera menus, I think honestly it has fairly nice looking menus. Additionally, the menus themselves are pretty straightforward. There really isn't too much to it, and there isn't that much customization, so there's not a lot of menu diving to do in the camera. That being said, when you are using the camera, there are some hiccups. This is, after all, a first-gen mirrorless camera. The EVF is, well, meh. The resolution is quite low. May I remind you, 921 K-dots. Again, if you compare it to something like the G1 or GH1, it is lower than what's on here. It's even lower than, I think, the VF2 from Olympus, which is the clip-on one. But, that aside, resolution aside, the EVF itself is also quite tunnely. When you look through the EVF, and if you have the G1 or GH1 beside you, you will notice that the EVF on the NX10 does look quite a bit smaller. Now, it's not too bad, but it's not great. Now, that can, things are saved a bit by that rear panel, again, being an OLED. It was one of the weird selling points that Samsung did for this series of cameras, but I do really, find myself using the EVF more often, or trying to use the EVF more often, and then just kind of getting frustrated and putting the camera down at eye level to use the rear screen. So yeah, just an FYI, EVF not a strong suit. Another thing that's kind of neat is that this camera can link exposure to the AF point, which interesting trick for a camera of this age. I don't know if other cameras done this, but neat that Samsung did. Now, one thing that is, again, nice about shooting this mirrorless camera is that it is mirrorless, so you do get the side benefit of lens adaptability. This is mostly true for the NX system, but you will find that when it comes to adaptability, you can't adapt everything. For example, Leica M or LTM lenses don't quite work. The flange distance a little too far up. But that being said, Given the adaptability, you'd think that there is some good manual focus aids, which we'd established there aren't really. The other focusing aid, aside from that weird contrast detect of the NX11 firmware that I loaded, is a punch-in. And the punch-in on the NX10 is only a 2x punch-in, which is kind of weird. It's not a lot, but hey, it's something. But other weird things though is that when you do punch-in, you can't move where the punch-in square is. It's only at the center. So these are weird lateral moves by Samsung. But hey, at least it's, better than the Nikon 1 series that just kind of disable metering. So, not a high bar to clear, but whatever. Now, again, when it comes to lens adaptability, you'll find that most everything from the SLR/DSLR age will adapt just fine. And as I said before, it's just like the closer ones, like your rangefinder ones, that may have issues adapting onto the NX series. When it comes to native lenses though, just an FYI, if it wasn't clear, the lenses all focus via fly-by-wire. Now, I realized that at the time this was the new cool, so I won't fault it that much, but I do miss the age of real focus rings. And, that's probably just me complaining, being an old curmudgeon, but yeah, something to consider. Shooting with the NX10, image quality and autofocus. The NX10's resolution is 14.6 megapixels, which I find to be pretty reasonable given this day and age. Again, not as high as contemporary APS-C cameras. It isn't no Fujifilm X-T5, but it is no means too little to get by on. This sensor is also in the age of cameras where they had AA filters on it, so absolute sharpness will be lower than modern cameras that are AA sensor-less. But sharpness ain't everything, and I'm more than happy to shoot this camera with all things considered. Where this camera does kind of fall a bit short, again, isn't resolution, it's dynamic range and noise performance. Admittedly, normally I'm pretty forgiving in this regard, and I'll be a little more forgiving in this regard as well, since this is Samsung's second ever big sensor product to, hit the market. So it's not as mature as Sony's sensors that they were cranking out at the time. Overall, it's not bad. But just to point out, even when it was new, this sensor felt like it was already 1 or 2 generations old. So you just have to be aware that when you are shooting, you have less wiggle room with other cameras, even of this era. So you don't have as much pushing or pulling ability on the files. Now, let's have a quick look at the noise performance, and to compare it, we will put it beside the Pentax K5, which was released in the same year, albeit about 8 months after the NX10. So by all accounts, they are the same generation of camera. In my opinion, the NX10 falls quite a bit short in the noise department. At ISO 800 and onward, I think it really kind of falls apart. From 100 to 800, it's a perfectly fine file. Now, when you look at the K5, the performance really pulls ahead at 800 and above. For me, the K5 at 3200 looks kind of like the NX10 at 800, and the K5 at 1280 looks like the NX10 at like ISO 3200. So yeah, noise performance is not superb. Luckily, as always, this is where modern noise reduction can come in. Not necessarily AI, just like modern algorithms will save the day. And while yes, the noise can be bad, in the event that I still need to get the photo, or would like to get the photo, I will still push the NX10 to ISO 3200, again, if I really want that shot. All in all, I'd say good effort by Samsung, but even better effort by Sony and Canon. When it comes to autofocus, you have to remember this is a first-gen mirrorless camera. There is no dual pixel, no on-sensor phase detect, no DFD, just normal contrast detect. That being said, I do find it pretty good for solid objects, and overall focus speed isn't that slow feeling. It's gonna be slow if you're coming from a modern mirrorless camera, but it won't be agonizing. It will be pretty accurate though, so that's not bad. Now, the only real complaint I have is that it's definitely really not great in low light. There was quite a bit of a tendency for this camera to hunt back and forth and just give up. I need to either try a couple times or reposition the focus box on top of the subject where there's visibly more contrast, and then just reframe. Overall, a little annoying, not the worst. Again, you can't really expect that much for an older mirrorless camera like this. And in daylight, it's perfectly fine. When it comes to continuous tracking though, that's a big nope. This camera always feels like it's just a second behind, which I suppose isn't the worst thing anyways, since it can only really shoot at 3 FPS for 3 RAWs, which, not very good. An action shooter, it ain't. And the RAWs are also kind of chunky. They're 25 megabytes each, even though this is a 14 megapixel camera. So the buffer will take time to clear. Just in case you're curious what the 3 FPS sounds like, let's have a go. Oh, I think it actually managed 4 or 5 frames. But yeah, now it's stuck right into the card. Now, when it comes to Samsung color science, let's have a look at the sample gallery. Video mode, right. I do gotta talk about that, I suppose. I almost forgot that it had one. Although, it's hard to do that because this camera does actually have the video mode on the mode dial right there, if you can see it. Anyways, it shoots 720p clips, and in this movie mode, you can either set it at program auto or aperture priority. And this will actually attempt to do continuous autofocus. However, I do find it's very dopey. So I just recommend shooting it in manual mode if you can, or if you'll even bother doing that with, the 720p video output. Let's have a look at some samples from it. Is this camera worth considering? Honestly, if you're looking for just a mirrorless camera to get into, I'd say no. If you're looking for Samsung specifically, maybe? There are other options, of course, though, from Samsung, but this would be not a bad one given its price, being one of the cheaper models currently. But, there are generally just a couple factors that make this camera kind of unappealing either way. And honestly, it doesn't have that much to do with the camera itself, although there is some of that. But just, as an aside, I personally think the camera itself is pretty nice, aside from the tunnely EVF and the slightly old feeling sensor. I found myself kind of picking this up more than I thought I would when I was in Korea. And it's especially nice with the pancake lens on there. I mean, just look how small this is. So yeah, it ended up coming with me quite a few times on my Korea trip. Again, there are other factors at play though. The camera itself, despite being fun, is difficult to recommend for a couple of reasons. One, price. I did get mine exceptionally cheap, and I got it in Korea, but I also, again, got it as is, so there was a risk that it wasn't gonna work. But if you were looking online at the E of bays, the going rate is kind of a bit of a wide range, but it's somewhere between around 100 USD to 200 USD. On the low end, that could get you a solid, alternate camera like the GH1 or G1. It could also get you a solid DSLR like the Pentax K5. On the high end, you could probably get the Panasonic G3. So competition is kind of steep in this price range. But if you can overlook the price issues, I personally think there are two other things that are an issue with the NX series in general. If I remember right, this wasn't that popular, and I'm gonna bet that you might not remember this series either. The result of that is that they didn't really sell that well, which leads to two other problems. Finding an NX10 is kind of difficult. They don't come up that often. The other problem that comes with it is that most of the times when you find or look for NX stuff, finding lenses that are not the 18-55 kit lens is kind of difficult. Now, the 18-55 is actually a pretty solid lens, and it has optical image stabilization. But I personally think the NX10 shines with a tiny pancake like this 30mm f2. And while it's not that hard to find for this particular lens, it's not that cheap. It comes in at roughly 140 to 160 USD. And, for the lenses that you can find from Samsung, it is a little more common than the other ones, but it isn't the easiest thing to get. And when it comes to other Samsung lenses, they had actually a fairly limited range, but there were really nice high quality primes, and even some third-party lenses from the likes of Samyang. But those other lenses seem to be pretty rare. Like, I think I maybe only saw 1 or 2 auctions for like the 85mm that they had. So all in all, even if you factor in the camera body, the cost of getting a lens, the total price could like easily eclipse what it would cost to get a fairly modern micro four thirds lens and camera combo. And you know, you can get a whole other like range of DSLR and lens combinations. And again, even if you could overlook the janky manual focus settings and say you were just going to pick up the NX10 to use on adapted lenses, you have to contend with the weird like lack of punch-in, the lack of ability to move your focus spot when you're punching in manually. But if you can get over that, adapters for the NX mount are still available, and you can find them on Amazon and like AliExpress. Anyways, this has been a pretty rambly video. So now I have a question for you. Did anyone watching have one of these Samsung NX cameras when they were new? And if you did you like it? If not, no. If you didn't have one of the cameras, not if you didn't like it. If you didn't like it, also let me know. But if you didn't have one of these Samsung cameras, would you want one now? Personally, when I was looking around for cameras and stuff in Korea, it wasn't until a little bit later on that I thought, Samsung did make a camera. So for a little while, I had straight up forgotten about this range. But that's all I got for this video. And as always, let me know your thoughts on it in the comments below. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Maybe a super thanks if you're into that. Till next time, bye.